My mother looked right at me during my 34th birthday dinner, then raised her glass to toast my brother's huge milestone. Nobody said happy birthday. Nobody said my name. 12 hours later, I bought a $95,000 Tesla in cash. The next morning, my father saw the insurance email and called an emergency family meeting. He was not panicking about the car. He panicked because I had finally traced what they hid for years. My name is Olive Wells. I am 34 years old, and for the last 5 years, my life has been a meticulously calculated algorithm of risk and mitigation. As the director of continuity strategy at Aegis Harbor Systems out in Denver, my actual job is to look at worst-case scenarios, such as power grid failures, supply chain collapses, and catastrophic data breaches, and build a structural bridge over the wreckage. I am exceptionally good at keeping complex systems from falling apart. I just never realized I needed a continuity plan for my own family. I flew into Charlotte on a Thursday evening. It had been a grueling 6 months of merger acquisitions, endless board meetings, and living out of cramped carry-on luggage. The flight was delayed for 2 hours, but I did not care. Tonight was supposed to be a rare, quiet sanctuary. Tonight was my birthday dinner. I pulled my rental car into the driveway of my childhood home, the familiar brick colonial looking deceptively welcoming under the warm amber porch lights. The humid Carolina air clung to my skin as I stepped out. I was carrying 2 heavy canvas bags from a high-end grocer, the woven handles biting into my palms. Inside was a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir I had been saving for 3 years, a pair of dry-aged ribeye steaks, and a small, artisan vanilla bean cake from a bakery downtown. I thought we were doing an intimate dinner. Just my parents and me. A quiet acknowledgement that their daughter had survived another year and successfully closed the biggest corporate deal of her career. I nudged the heavy oak front door open with my hip, expecting the familiar quiet of my parents watching evening television. Instead, the house smelled not of roasting meat or garlic, but of cheap Prosecco and melted wax. A low, vibrating murmur of excited voices drifted down the hall from the kitchen. I walked down the hallway, the hardwood floors creaking the exact same way they had when I was a teenager sneaking in past curfew. I stepped into the archway of the spacious kitchen and completely froze. I stood there with my canvas bags drooping heavily from my shoulders, feeling like a lost catering delivery driver who had stumbled into the wrong zip code. My mother, Marion Wells, was leaning over the massive granite center island, carefully adjusting a sprawling linen tablecloth. She was fussing intensely with a massive, tiered sheet cake. It was not a delicate vanilla bean pastry. It was aggressively frosted in navy blue and gold, with the words, "Common Ground Labs A New Era," piped in thick, shimmering icing. Around the island stood a tight cluster of aunts, uncles, and family friends. Every single one of them had their smartphone raised in the air, screens glowing, recording my younger brother, Beck Wells. Beck was holding a crystal glass of champagne, his hair perfectly tousled in that effortless artistic way that actually takes 45 minutes and expensive salon pomade to achieve. He was glowing with the radiant energy of a man who had never been told no. He had just signed a lease for his new creative community space. It was his 4th grand business venture in 6 years. The first 3 had quietly imploded, their substantial debts mysteriously vanishing into the familial ether. But Beck was never considered a failure in this house. He was treated as a misunderstood visionary, simply waiting for the right economic climate. Nobody noticed me at first. I was just a silent shadow standing in the archway. Then Marion looked up. She did not drop her champagne flute in shock. She did not look embarrassed or apologetic. She simply glided over to me, her smile tight, polished, and perfectly practiced. "Oh, sweetheart, you made it," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over Beck's booming theatrical laughter. She patted my arm dismissively, her eyes already darting aggressively back to the center of attention. "We will do your birthday later. Tonight is a big night for Beck." A chill ran down my spine, sharp and absolute. It was not the words themselves, but the casual, effortless way she discarded my existence. I looked past her shoulder. my eyes landing on the elaborate table decorations. Flanking that obnoxious sheet cake were two heavy antique silver candlesticks. They were heirloom pieces from my great-grandmother. When I graduated from my rigorous master's program, Marion had explicitly told me she was saving those exact candlesticks for my special day, a wedding, a major promotion, something monumental. Now, they were dripping hot white wax onto a table celebrating a commercial lease agreement for a 30-year-old man who still brought his dirty laundry home on Thanksgiving weekend. Listen up, everyone. My father, Ronan Wells, announced loudly. He clinked his silver spoon against his glass, instantly commanding the attention of the entire room. He wrapped a heavy paternal arm around Beck's shoulders. Ronan's chest puffed out with a profound, radiant pride I had never, not once in my 34 years, seen directed at me. "We are here to celebrate the kid who dares to dream big," Ronan boomed, his voice thick with raw emotion. "It takes guts to build something from the ground up. It takes true vision. And Beck, son, you have more vision than anyone I know. To the future." The room erupted in enthusiastic applause. My father's words hung in the air, heavy and deeply suffocating. When I successfully restructured a failing regional branch of my company and single-handedly saved 200 jobs, Ronan had patted my back politely and asked if I was finally going to start taking weekends off to find a husband. For Beck, he was delivering an emotional monologue worthy of a cinematic climax. I did not scream. I did not throw the bottle of vintage Pinot Noir against the custom Italian tile backsplash. I did not shed a single pathetic tear. The sophisticated algorithm in my head violently shifted gears. The continuity strategy kicked in. I smiled. It was a perfectly pleasant, utterly hollow, terrifyingly polite smile. I walked quietly over to the side counter, gently placing my heavy grocery bags next to a towering stack of dirty appetizer plates. I turned back to my mother, keeping my voice impeccably steady, modulated to the exact frequency of a detached corporate professional concluding a useless meeting. "I am going to head out," I said quietly, ensuring my tone betrayed absolutely nothing. I would hate to ruin the mood of success. "Congratulations to Beck." Marion blinked rapidly, opening her mouth to offer some half-hearted, manipulative platitude about how I should at least stay for a thin slice of cake, but I was already turning away. I walked out the front door, the solid thud of the heavy oak shutting behind me sounding exactly like the closing of a bank vault. I did not drive back to my old childhood bedroom. I drove straight back to the financial district of downtown Charlotte and checked into a sprawling corner suite at a luxury hotel. The room was aggressively modern, bathed in sterile, cool light and entirely devoid of any messy, suffocating familial history. I sat on the edge of the firm king mattress, staring out at the glowing city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I opened my laptop. I logged directly into my primary financial portal. Staring back at me in stark black numbers was the massive equity payout and retention bonus from the recent corporate buyout. It was a staggering number with a lot of zeros. A number I had earned through 80 grueling hours of work per week, missed holidays, and relentless, agonizing discipline. A number I usually would have shuttled immediately into a highly diversified index fund or a safe conservative municipal bond. I closed the banking tab and opened a new browser window. For 34 years, I had made myself incredibly small so Beck could comfortably take up all the oxygen in the room. I had silently accepted the leftover scraps of parental affection, the constantly delayed celebrations, and the unspoken mandate that my financial and emotional stability was merely the required backdrop for his endless chaos. I navigated to the official Tesla website. I clicked on the highest performance trim model available. I purposefully selected the premium white leather interior, the extended range battery pack, and the fully upgraded autonomous technological package. It was exactly the kind of flashy, unapologetic, highly visible purchase my mother would constantly sneer at as a tragic waste of wealth. The total came to exactly $95,000. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not look for reasonable financing options or calculate the monthly interest rates. I entered my primary routing number and paid for the entire vehicle in a single cash transaction. The bright confirmation screen popped up, stark and beautiful in its undeniable finality. I took a high-resolution screenshot. I had a private social media account. I rarely posted on it, treating it mostly as a digital scrapbook, but I knew for an absolute fact that my mother and my father constantly monitored it through a fake profile to secretly keep tabs on my life without actually having to speak to me directly. I uploaded the screenshot. I did not add a clever caption. I did not add a location tag. I just hit publish and watched the loading bar complete its journey. I laid back on the crisp, perfectly ironed white hotel pillows. The silence of the suite was absolute. For the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, terrifyingly awake, and the balance of power had officially shifted. The morning sun hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite was blindingly bright. I sat in a plush armchair, holding a ceramic cup of dark roast coffee that had long gone cold. I had not even taken a third sip when the sharp, digital trill of my phone shattered the absolute silence of the room. The caller identification flashed on the screen. Ronan Wells. I let it ring 3 times. In the past, I would have scrambled to answer on the first ring, my heart rate spiking with the conditioned anxiety of a child summoned to the principal's office. Today, I simply watched the screen glow, taking a slow, measured breath before swiping to accept the call. "Hello, Dad," I said. My voice was entirely flat, stripped of any daughterly warmth. There was no reciprocal greeting. There was no awkward clearing of the throat, no passive-aggressive inquiry about where I had vanished to the night before, and absolutely no mention of the fact that he and my mother had entirely ignored my 34th birthday. "Where did you get the money to buy that $95,000 car?" Ronan demanded. His voice was completely wrong. When my father was angry, his tone was expansive, loud, and designed to consume all the acoustic space in a room. This was different. His voice was compressed, clipped, and vibrating with a frantic, tightly leashed panic. He sounded like a man standing on a landmine, terrified that shifting his weight would trigger a catastrophic explosion. I took a slow sip of my cold coffee. "I bought it with the money I earned. Dad, I had a very successful quarter at work." Silence stretched across the cellular connection. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. He was breathing hard through his nose. The sheer calmness of my response seemed to agitate him further. He was not reacting like a conservative parent horrified by a depreciating luxury asset. He was probing. He was trying to figure out which account I had pulled the funds from, listening for a specific hesitation in my voice. "You do not just drop almost $100,000 in cash without a plan, Olive," he snapped, the panic leaking slightly through the cracks of his authoritative facade. "That is not how we raised you to handle finances." "I handled it perfectly fine," I replied smoothly. "The transaction cleared this morning." I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head, the desperate recalculations happening behind his eyes. He was not verifying my financial literacy. He was checking my perimeter. Less than 60 seconds into the phone call, Ronan issued his absolute directive. "Saturday night, 7 o'clock, family meeting at the house, mandatory attendance. Do not be late." He terminated the connection before I could even formulate a response. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. I waited for the familiar wave of dread to wash over me, the heavy, sinking feeling in my gut that usually accompanied my father's strict summons. It never came. Instead, a strange, electric sensation prickled across my skin. It was a feeling of profound, glacial clarity. For the very first time in my entire existence, the power dynamic in my family had violently shifted on its axis, and I was the one holding the lever. Ronan was terrified. But why? I stood up and began pacing the length of the hotel room, my bare feet sinking into the thick, plush carpet. A director of continuity strategy is meticulously trained to look at isolated anomalies, minor discrepancies in data, and find the catastrophic systemic failure hiding beneath them. I started running my family's recent history through my professional mental algorithm. pulling up fragments of memories that I had previously dismissed as harmless background noise. I thought about the misdirected financial emails. Over the past 2 years, I had occasionally received vague notifications from a boutique wealth management portal. The emails never contained specific account balances, just generic updates about policy changes or quarterly statements being available for download. I had always assumed it was a careless clerical error, perhaps my parents accidentally listing my email address as a secondary contact for their modest retirement accounts. I had just deleted them, annoyed by the digital clutter. Then, I remembered a highly uncomfortable dinner conversation from 2 Thanksgivings ago. I had casually mentioned to my mother that I was officially pre-approved for a mortgage and was actively looking to buy a modern townhouse in the trendy arts district of Denver. Marion had practically dropped her crystal wine glass. It had shattered on the hardwood floor, but she did not even look down at the mess. She had turned deathly pale, immediately snapping her head toward Ronan, who had aggressively intervened. He had spent the next 45 minutes aggressively lecturing me about how the housing market was a volatile, dangerous bubble. He insisted that renting was the absolute only sensible option for a single corporate woman, and he had practically begged me not to let any major bank run a deep, comprehensive credit check on me. He had framed it as parental protection. I had thought they were just being their usual, overbearing, controlling selves, desperately trying to keep me tethered and reliant. My pacing stopped abruptly in the center of the room. I remembered a very specific, automated email that had bypassed my primary inbox and landed directly in my digital spam folder exactly 3 months ago. The subject line had been a confusing jumble of alphanumeric routing codes, but the sender profile had been listed as the Eleanor Shore Homestart Trust. I had been in the middle of a brutal, sleep-depriving merger negotiation at Aegis Harbor Systems, working 80-hour weeks, and I had simply purged the entire spam folder without ever opening the document. A chilling, paralyzing possibility bloomed in the very center of my chest, spreading ice through my veins. My parents were not calling an emergency family meeting because they were worried I was spiraling into massive, irresponsible consumer debt. They did not care if I bankrupted myself. They were calling a mandatory meeting because they were completely terrified that I had suddenly acquired a massive sum of liquid cash without their permission or knowledge. They were not worried about the health of my personal bank accounts. They were terrified I had somehow stumbled into theirs. Or far worse, they were terrified I had finally discovered a hidden pool of money that was legally supposed to be mine. A pool they had been quietly, systematically draining for years to fund my brother's endless string of failures. If my father was panicking about a $95,000 cash purchase, it meant he sincerely thought I had somehow used funds he desperately needed to remain invisible and untouched. I walked purposefully over to the sleek, tempered glass desk in the corner of the suite and opened my heavy corporate laptop. The high-resolution screen flared to life, casting a harsh, sterile blue glow across my face. 8 years ago, right after I graduated with honors and secured my first entry-level corporate job, I had tried to be the perfect, helpful, organized daughter. I had set up a highly encrypted, cloud-based archival system for our family's important legal and financial documents. I had spent an entire weekend digitizing their tax returns, property deeds, and insurance policies, organizing everything into neat, meticulously labeled digital folders. I had handed them the login credentials on a printed card and told them to utilize it for their own security. Over time, as Beck's chaotic, debt-fueled business ventures consumed all their attention and resources, they had completely stopped mentioning the archive. They assumed I had forgotten about it. They assumed I had long lost the master administrative access in the shuffle of my busy career. I never lose administrative access to anything. It is literally my job to maintain the keys to the kingdom. I navigated to the secure login portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, entering the complex 30-character alphanumeric passphrase I had memorized nearly a decade ago. I clicked the 2-factor authentication prompt, calmly approved the login via the secure encrypted application on my cellular phone, and watched the digital progress bar load across the screen. The master dashboard appeared on my display. The digital vault was wide open, completely unprotected from my view. I stared at the neatly arranged rows of yellow folder icons. This was no longer just a boring repository for old utility bills and faded medical records. It was a locked room full of buried secrets, and I had just turned the heavy brass key. I saw folders labeled with current tax years, folders labeled with property addresses, and several newly created folders simply labeled with my brother's initials. The family meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock on Saturday night completely transformed in my mind, the entire dynamic inverted. It was no longer going to be an aggressive interrogation where I sat on the defensive, desperately trying to justify my right to spend my own hard-earned money. It was not going to be another tedious lecture about familial responsibility and supporting my brother's dreams. As I moved my cursor toward the very first folder, the air conditioning in the hotel room felt absolutely freezing against my skin. I was deliberately stepping into a financial crime scene, and I was going to meticulously gather every single piece of undeniable evidence before the primary suspects even knew an official investigation had begun. Saturday night was not a family meeting anymore. It was going to be a forensic audit, and I was going to be the one asking the questions. The digital archive was structured exactly as I had left it years ago, but it had grown bloated, corrupted by a messy trail of recent uploads. My parents were completely digitally illiterate, treating the highly secure cloud server like a bottomless, unorganized junk drawer. The cursor on my screen hovered over the neat rows of yellow folder icons. The names they had chosen were lazy, almost insulting in their careless mundanity. A folder labeled House, another named Tax, a catch-all titled Maisk, and then a jarringly specific, incredibly bloated directory simply named Beck Expansion. I clicked into the miscellaneous folder first. It was a chaotic digital dumping ground of scanned utility bills, faded property tax receipts, and scanned appliance warranties. But as I scrolled slowly past the mundane records of suburban life, a single, solitary document caught my eye, sitting completely out of place among the electric bills. The file name was a long, unbroken string of text separated by underscores. I double-clicked the file named Eleanor_Shore, _Homestart, _Trust, _Distribution, PDF. The document rendered slowly on the high-resolution screen, eventually filling my display with the crisp, sterile letterhead of a boutique wealth management firm based in Raleigh. My breath hitched. A sharp, involuntary intake of cold air that burned the back of my throat. Aunt Eleanor. She had passed away when I was in my early 20s, leaving behind a modest but highly respectable estate. I knew she had set up a trust, explicitly designated for me, intended to be a foundational stepping stone for my future. It was supposed to be the safety net for my higher education or the solid down payment on my first home. My parents were legally named as the custodians until I reached a specific age or life milestone, but the money was unequivocally, legally mine. I had never asked for it, always assuming it was sitting safely in an escrow account, quietly growing interest for a rainy day when I truly needed it. I scrolled down past the dense legal boilerplate to the ledger section of the document. The neat columns of text and numbers began to blur for a fraction of a second, then sharpened with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Every line felt like a meticulous, calculated knife turning in my gut. The ledger detailed a relentless series of withdrawals spanning the last 4 years. They were not marked as educational expenses. They were not marked as real estate investments. They were casually, brutally categorized under a vague, legally ambiguous term family advances. I tallied the sums in my head, my corporate training automatically taking over. $5,000 withdrawn in early spring. $12,000 wired out in the middle of summer. $8,000 liquidated right before the holidays. The total drain amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. It was a staggering hemorrhage of capital, a slow, methodical bleeding of my hidden safety net. Where did the money go? I split my screen, opening the corresponding bank statements stored in the tax folder to cross-reference the exact withdrawal dates. The outflows did not correspond to emergency medical bills. They did not align with a sudden spike in my parents' variable mortgage rate or a necessary expensive roof repair. The money bypassed our family household entirely and flowed directly into a web of obscure, newly formed corporate entities: Common Ground Labs, Limited Liability Company, Beacon Yard Ventures. The names sounded like the kind of fake, hollow startup companies used in freshman business school case studies. I saw itemized bank transfers for premium commercial space leasing, high-end interior design consultations, comprehensive liability insurance premiums, and bulk orders of custom marketing materials. Every single disbursement, every stolen dollar from Aunt Eleanor's legacy, was a direct arterial line feeding Beck's delusions of grandeur. A specific date on a cleared check caught my eye, completely locking the air in my lungs. It was from 3 years ago. It was right around the exact time I was seriously considering applying for a rigorous, part-time Master of Business Administration program to accelerate my upward trajectory at the firm. I had driven over to the house that weekend, armed with glossy university brochures and a meticulously drafted budget, hoping for a little moral support or perhaps a small, formal loan from the trust I knew existed but never touched. I vividly remembered sitting at the gleaming kitchen island, the very same island where they had just celebrated Beck a few hours ago with my stolen inheritance. I remembered my mother letting out a long, heavy, exhausted sigh as she looked at my spreadsheets. She had placed her perfectly manicured hand over mine, her eyes swimming with manufactured, condescending sympathy. She had looked right at me and said, "Olive, adults cannot always pursue everything they want. Sometimes we have to be practical and make do with what we have." I looked back at the bank statement corresponding to that exact same month. While I was abandoning my advanced degree to be a practical, responsible adult, my trust fund was being actively liquidated to finance Beck's sudden, fleeting obsession with digital media production. There were cleared checks for a full, premium studio renovation, thousands of dollars spent on massive, illuminated outdoor signage, receipts for top-of-the-line live streaming equipment he never learned how to use. And most infuriating of all, a massive penalty fee paid in full to break a previous commercial lease he had simply abandoned out of boredom, because the neighborhood did not have the right creative energy. My chest felt incredibly tight, a band of cold iron wrapping securely around my ribs. I navigated back to the main directory and opened the folder labeled Beck Expansion. Inside was a disorganized, chaotic cluster of forwarded emails and contractor quotes. I clicked on a message thread between my father and the wealth manager handling the trust. The manager, a professional with a strict fiduciary duty, was gently but firmly questioning the frequency of the trust withdrawals, politely reminding my father of the original intent of the funds. My father had replied with a curt, aggressive authorization to execute the transfer regardless. But it was the forwarded note at the very top of the chain, sent from my father's personal email account to my mother, that finally shattered whatever residual, pathetic illusion of family I had left clinging to my bones. It was a single, devastating sentence typed in stark, black font. "Olive is fine. Beck is the one who cannot handle failure." I sat back in the ergonomic hotel chair, the harsh, sterile glow of the screen illuminating the absolute stillness of the room. The narrative of my entire life fractured, splintered, and realigned into a horrifying new shape. This was no longer a sad, pathetic suburban story about emotional favoritism. It was not just about the golden boy getting more praise, a bigger piece of cake, or the antique silver candlesticks. It was a fully operational, ruthlessly efficient financial system. In my parents' eyes, my fierce independence, my quiet competence, and my hard-won stability were not admirable traits to be celebrated. They were a shared, exploitable resource. My success was the silent battery that powered my brother's endless, loud, chaotic failures. They did not just prefer him. They actively cannibalized my future to subsidize his present. They looked at my ability to survive and decided it gave them the fundamental right to steal from me. I closed the email thread. My hands were perfectly, terrifyingly steady. There were no tears, no shaking shoulders, no dramatic gasps of sorrow. The cold, highly analytical part of my brain, The exact part that rebuilt failing corporate infrastructures and mitigated catastrophic losses, took complete, absolute control over my nervous system. I knew from years of dissecting corporate disasters and auditing broken supply chains that people who rationalize stealing from their own flesh and blood rarely stop at just one isolated account. If my parents were comfortable draining a legally restricted trust fund and forging a moral justification for it, they were comfortable crossing entirely different, much darker lines. The Eleanor Shore money was just the surface layer of the rot. I moved my cursor slowly to the next row of yellow folders. I was not done. The investigation had barely started, and I knew with absolute chilling certainty that families who build their foundations on this kind of quiet theft never just take the money once and walk away. The glow of the laptop screen felt completely different now. It was no longer just illuminating a gross misuse of family funds. It was casting a harsh, unforgiving light on active, deliberate fraud. I navigated away from the static bank statements and opened a subfolder buried 3 layers deep inside the digital directory. It was simply labeled with the name of a highly popular, secure electronic signature platform. I stared at the familiar blue corporate logo. 4 years ago, during the height of a massive global logistical shutdown, my parents had needed to sign some standard municipal tax forms, and they had been entirely paralyzed by the complex digital process. I had spent 2 hours on a video call, patiently walking my father through the exact steps of setting up a secure account, verifying his identity, and applying a verified digital stamp. I had essentially handed him the loaded weapon he was now aiming directly at my future. I opened the first encrypted document in the stack. It was a massive 40-page commercial refinancing agreement for a property lease. I scrolled rapidly to the final page, my eyes scanning past the dense blocks of indemnification clauses until I hit the primary signature blocks. There, sitting perfectly aligned on the digital line, was my name. It was a legally binding, electronically verified signature, complete with a timestamp and a unique cryptographic hash. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I looked closely at the exact date and time stamped next to my forged consent. It was the 14th of October, 2 years ago, at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I did not need to check my calendar or open my corporate planner to know exactly where I was on that specific Tuesday. I was standing on a brightly lit stage in a massive convention center in Chicago, delivering a keynote address on supply chain resilience to an audience of 3,000 industry executives. My phone had been turned off and locked securely in a green room safe. I had not signed a single piece of paper that day, let alone a legally binding commercial refinancing agreement in the state of North Carolina. I forced myself to read the actual text of the document I had supposedly authorized. It was a beneficiary consent form. The dense legal jargon essentially stated that I, acting as the primary beneficiary of the Eleanor Shore Homestart Trust, was willingly and explicitly agreeing to pledge a significant portion of my remaining unliquidated assets as temporary collateral to secure a high-risk, short-term cash flow rescue loan. The sole beneficiary of this desperate financial lifeline was, of course, Common Ground Labs. The air in the hotel suite suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the climate control system had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. They had not just taken the liquid cash that was readily available to them, they had actively mortgaged the principal balance of my inheritance to keep my brother's sinking ship afloat for just a few more months. My hands flew across the keyboard. I immediately logged into the major credit bureaus and initiated a comprehensive, hard pull of my complete credit history. The detailed report generated on my screen a few seconds later, sprawling across the monitor in a dense matrix of trade lines and payment histories. My personal credit was immaculate, an impenetrable fortress of on-time payments and incredibly low utilization ratios. But as I scrolled down to the section listing associated addresses and contact information, a cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. Tucked neatly beneath my current Denver apartment address was an old, completely obscure email address I had created during my freshman year of college. I had not accessed that specific inbox in over a decade. Right next to it was a fresh, active trade line for a massive commercial line of credit. The status was currently listed in good standing, but the total liability attached directly to my Social Security number was absolutely staggering. I had never authorized it. I had never received a single alert, because every notification, every statement, and every urgent warning was being silently routed to a dead digital inbox controlled entirely by someone else. I switched back to the family archive, a terrifying, hyper-focused energy propelling me forward. I needed to see exactly how they had justified this internally. I needed to see the underlying architecture of their betrayal. I found it inside a folder labeled with the name of a local community bank. It was an email thread between my father and a junior commercial loan underwriter. The bank was clearly hesitating to extend any further credit to Beck's perpetually failing enterprise. The underwriter was politely requesting additional guarantors or significantly stronger collateral to approve the transaction. My father's response was not just a calculated business decision, it was a complete, horrifying psychological autopsy of exactly how he viewed his only daughter. "We will attach Olive as a guarantor," Ronan had written. "Use Olive's name on the primary application. It will make the approval rate cleaner because her credit profile is very strong. Do not bother contacting her directly for the verifications. I handle all her administrative paperwork locally. She's incredibly busy out west." I sat perfectly still, reading that single paragraph over and over until the individual letters began to lose their meaning. In my family's eyes, I was not just the independent, low-maintenance child who rarely asked for help. I was the perfect, highly optimized legal buffer. I was obedient enough to never question their management of my childhood accounts. And I was financially successful enough that no bank auditor or legal clerk would ever suspect I was being systematically exploited by my own parents. They had weaponized my own responsibility against me. My immaculate credit score was nothing more than a pristine, heavy shield they used to protect Beck from the inevitable consequences of his own profound incompetence. But the absolute worst discovery was still waiting for me inside a subfolder marked for the previous tax year. I opened a federal tax schedule form, the specific kind used to report income, deductions, and credits from partnerships and corporate entities. My name was clearly printed at the top, right next to my full Social Security number. According to the federal government, I was officially listed as a 15% silent equity partner in Beck's newest corporate entity. I stared at the percentage, 15%. It was not a random number. I quickly searched the local city council's public records database for commercial grant applications. Within 3 minutes, I found exactly what I was looking for. Beck had applied for a massive neighborhood revitalization grant, a program heavily subsidized by taxpayer dollars. To qualify for the top tier of funding, the applicant business needed to demonstrate a specific threshold of diverse, financially stable equity backing. My father had not just forged my signature to steal my money. He had fraudulently drafted me into a highly regulated corporate partnership simply to make Beck's application look attractive to a municipal oversight committee. The true, terrifying reality of my situation finally crystallized in my mind. This was no longer just about losing my inheritance or having my feelings hurt at a birthday dinner. If Beck's new creative community space collapsed, which history absolutely guaranteed it would not just be out the stolen cash. As a registered 15% equity partner, the inevitable fallout would stick directly to me. When the vendors stopped getting paid, when the commercial landlord filed for eviction, and when the federal tax authorities came looking for their missing payroll taxes, my name was officially on the foundational paperwork. I could be dragged into severe tax liabilities, endless corporate litigation, and potentially devastating legal ruin. They had tied me securely to the tracks to ensure Beck's train could keep moving forward. I slowly closed the laptop, the sharp click of the latch echoing loudly in the completely silent hotel room. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the glowing city lights of Charlotte. The anger I felt was no longer hot, chaotic, or blinding. It had cooled into something dense, heavy, and absolutely unbreakable. I was not going to walk into my childhood home on Saturday night as a wounded daughter seeking an emotional apology. An apology was entirely useless against a forged commercial loan document. I was not going to yell. I was not going to demand explanations, and I was certainly not going to cry. I was going to step into that living room with an impenetrable binder of undeniable evidence. I was going to walk in with a meticulously documented timeline of every single fraudulent transaction, every forged electronic signature, and every stolen dollar. I was going to construct an airtight legal cage around them before they even realized I had locked the door. I had 48 hours to prepare my exit strategy, and I was going to use every single minute of it. I did not call my mother. I did not call my father. The very first call I made from the silence of my hotel suite was to Rowan Pike. Rowan and I had been best friends since our freshman year at the university, bonded by the specific, exhausting shared trauma of growing up in a middle-class American household where we were the designated responsible ones, forever standing in the long, dark shadow cast by a golden child. Rowan had a brother who could do no wrong, a brother who had wrecked 3 cars and still received a brand new one for his graduation while she worked 2 jobs to pay her own tuition. She knew the exact psychological architecture of my family. She knew how the trap worked. When she picked up the phone, I did not cry. I simply relayed the facts. I told her about the empty trust, the fake email address, the forged signature on the commercial loan, and the 15% equity stake in my brother's doomed venture. "Do not say a single word to them," Rowan instructed immediately, her voice stripped of any comforting warmth, replaced entirely by tactical precision. "Do not blow up. Do not text your mother and ask why she did it. You cannot treat this like a daughter about to have a screaming match with her parents. You are an executive dealing with massive financial fraud. Treat them like hostile corporate actors. I have an emergency family meeting mandated for Saturday night at 7 o'clock, I replied, pacing the length of the room. "Good. That gives us exactly 48 hours, Rowan said. "I am sending you a contact number right now. Call her the second we hang up. Her name is Mara Klein." She handled the asset untangling when my father tried to hide his debt under my mother's maiden name. I hung up and immediately dialed the number. Mara Klein did not have a receptionist. She answered on the second ring, her tone sharp and intensely focused. Within 30 minutes, I was sitting in a secure video conference with her, my screen shared so she could quickly review the digital archive I had uncovered. Mara was a consumer protection attorney who looked like she had not slept a full night in a decade, but her eyes missed absolutely nothing. She scanned the PDF of the trust ledger, the timestamp on the digital signature platform, and the municipal grant application. "Olive, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Mara said, leaning closer to her webcam. "This is no longer a messy family matter. We have crossed a very severe legal threshold here. What you are showing me is a volatile mixture of breach of fiduciary trust, wire fraud, and the deliberate forgery of electronic consent. If this community center project defaults, the creditors will not care that your father loves your brother more than you. They will look at the federal tax schedule, see your name, and they will come directly after your salary, your savings, and your future." "I know," I said quietly. "Tell me exactly how to build the firewall." Mara gave me a strict, uncompromising checklist. "First, you are going to immediately freeze your credit across all 3 major bureaus. Nobody opens a utility bill, a credit card, or a commercial line of credit in your name without a direct verbal authorization from you using a secure PIN code. Second, you are going to bypass this digital portal your parents use. You will request certified, hard copy records directly from the county clerk and the original lending institutions. We need the physical paper trail that they cannot conveniently delete or alter when they realize you are looking. Third, and absolutely most importantly, you do not give them a single warning that you know anything. You let them think they are walking into a standard family lecture to control your spending." I spent the next 8 hours doing exactly as she instructed. I transformed the raw, suffocating pain of my family's betrayal into a meticulous, sterilized project. I pulled the official deeds. I cross-referenced the dates of the forged signatures with my airline travel receipts, my hotel folios, and my corporate expense reports from the Chicago convention, proving without a shadow of a doubt that I could not have legally authorized those transactions. I built a chronological timeline that perfectly contrasted their warm, supportive parental dialogue against the cold, undeniable documentation of their continuous theft. Every time my mother had told me she was proud of my independence, a check had been cut to Beck. Every time my father had praised my relentless work ethic, my signature had been forged to prop up his son. Mara asked if I wanted to file a civil suit immediately or take the evidence straight to the local authorities. I declined the immediate nuclear option. I did not want to drag this through a public courtroom just yet. I wanted to look them in the eye in the very house where they had raised me to be their perfect fool. I wanted to confront them, but I refused to do it from the weak, defensive position I had occupied my entire life. I would not let my mother gaslight me into believing I was overreacting. I would not let my father manipulate the narrative until I was somehow apologizing for being a sensitive, ungrateful daughter who did not understand the complex nuances of family loyalty. I left the luxury hotel and drove my rental car to a high-end office supply store in the financial district. I purchased a thick, heavy-duty black binder, a set of reinforced alphabetical dividers, a professional hole punch, and a ream of premium, heavyweight paper. The cashier wished me a good afternoon, completely unaware she was ringing up the physical instruments of my family's destruction. I returned to my suite and spent the entire evening printing and organizing. I built a physical manifestation of their sins. The black binder was divided into 6 clear, devastatingly precise sections. Section 1 was labeled Trust. It contained the original Eleanor Shore documents and the corresponding bank transfers bleeding the account dry. Section 2 was Transfers. It mapped every stolen dollar directly into the corporate accounts of Common Ground Labs and Beacon Yard Ventures. Section 3 was Forged Consent. It held the loan documents featuring my fake signature, highlighted and paired directly with my verified location data from that exact date. Section 4 was Limited Liability Company Exposure. It laid out the fraudulent tax forms binding me to my brother's inevitable bankruptcy. Section 5 was Tax Risk. It contained the municipal grant applications weaponizing my pristine credit history to secure government funding. Section 6 was simply labeled Options. For that final section, Mara Klein had worked late into the night drafting a series of heavy legal countermeasures. They were my ultimate contingency plans. The first was a strict, legally binding reimbursement demand, outlining a non-negotiable schedule for my parents to repay every single cent they had siphoned from my trust. The second was a formal declaration of removal, legally severing my name from all of Beck's corporate entities. The third was a comprehensive tax exemption confirmation and a full indemnification clause, stating that Ronan and Marion Wells assumed total financial and legal responsibility for any fallout resulting from their fraudulent filings. I placed the thick stack of Mara's freshly printed legal documents into the final tab of the binder. I snapped the heavy metal rings shut. The sound was sharp, authoritative, and final. I walked over to the desk and picked up my phone. I opened my private social media application and looked at the photograph I had posted the night before. The confirmation screen for the $95,000 electric vehicle glowed against the dark background. When I had clicked the purchase button, I thought I was simply doing something reckless, a desperate, impulsive act of self-care to numb the sting of a stolen birthday. But as I stood there holding the heavy black binder, I realized the car was entirely different. It was not a reactionary purchase. It was the opening move on a chessboard they did not even know we were playing on. My father had panicked because the car represented a level of financial autonomy he thought he had successfully crippled. The vehicle was the very first signal that the obedient, quiet daughter who never checked the bank accounts was dead. I was not going to drive that car to my childhood home to sit on the sofa and play the role of the victim. I was driving it there to serve an eviction notice on the illusion of our family. The massive tinted glass doors of the premium automotive delivery center slid open with a soft, expensive whisper. I stepped out of the bright midday sun and walked across the flawlessly polished concrete floor of the showroom. The space was immense, clinically clean, and completely silent, smelling faintly of ozone and high-end industrial cleaning solvents. Walking toward the gleaming row of vehicles awaiting their new owners did not feel like a typical retail transaction. It did not feel like a shopping trip or a celebration of corporate success. As I approached the specific bay where my vehicle was parked, my chest felt tight. It felt exactly like stepping through a heavy, reinforced psychological door that had been dead-bolted shut for decades. I stopped at the edge of the delivery bay and just looked at it. The car was a striking, aerodynamic silhouette of dark metallic paint, but my eyes were immediately drawn to the cabin. I had deliberately selected the brightest, most impractical ultra-white vegan leather interior available. I had checked the box for the absolute most expensive technological upgrade package the manufacturer offered. It was a configuration of pure, unapologetic luxury. It was the exact type of vehicle my mother would dramatically roll her eyes at. I could practically hear her voice echoing in the sterile showroom, haughtily declaring that light-colored seats were a tragic waste of money, strictly reserved for people who desperately needed to show off to strangers. The delivery specialist, a polite young man with a tablet, walked me through the basic operational features. I nodded along, barely processing his words about regenerative braking and autonomous navigation limits. When he finally handed me the sleek black digital keycard and stepped away to process the final registration paperwork, I opened the heavy driver door and slid behind the steering wheel. The door closed with a solid, hermetic thud, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the showroom. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. I rested my hands on the smooth, cold curve of the steering wheel and leaned back into the perfectly contoured seat. Sitting in that pristine space, a massive, crushing wave of old, unhealed pain washed over me. I looked at the minimalist dashboard and began to remember every single time I had quietly, dutifully put my own desires back on the shelf. I remembered the winter I wore a thin, heavily patched wool coat to the office because I felt too guilty spending my bonus on myself while my parents were complaining about the rising cost of utilities. I remembered the beautiful mid-century modern dining table I had left sitting in an online shopping cart for 3 months, eventually deleting it because I convinced myself I did not truly need it. I remembered the advanced executive certification program I had abandoned. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously budgeting, saving, and depriving myself of joy under the guise of being a highly responsible, practical woman. But sitting in the driver's seat of a $95,000 electric vehicle, the devastating truth finally settled over my shoulders. I had not just been robbed of my financial assets. I had been systematically, ruthlessly conditioned by my own parents to believe that my own wants, my own comfort, and my own happiness must always be permanently subordinated to the endless spiraling chaos of my brother. They had trained me to believe that asking for anything for myself was inherently selfish. I pulled my phone from my purse to complete the final administrative task before driving off the lot. I logged into my auto insurance portal to formally add the new vehicle to my existing coverage plan. I quickly typed in the vehicle identification number, selected the highest tier of comprehensive coverage, and hit the final submit button. The loading icon spun on the screen for a few seconds before generating a green confirmation checkmark. However, right beneath the success message, a tiny line of gray text caught my eye. It was an automated notification receipt. Because I had initiated my very first independent auto insurance policy right after graduating from the university. My father's old email address was still buried deep within the legacy code of the system as a secondary emergency notification contact. A high-priority, automated alert detailing the addition of a brand-new, luxury electric vehicle had just been instantly dispatched directly to his inbox. I did not panic. I did not scramble to call the insurance broker to cancel the notification. I simply locked my phone, tossed it into the center console, and pressed the accelerator. The car surged forward out of the delivery bay, gliding onto the sunlit avenue with a smooth, silent, and terrifyingly fast burst of speed. It took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes for my phone to ring. I was back in the luxury suite of my hotel, standing by the window with a glass of sparkling water, watching the afternoon traffic crawl far below. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on the desk. It was not my father calling to interrogate me this time. It was Marion. I let it ring 4 times before slowly sliding my finger across the glass to answer. Olive, she snapped the absolute second the connection opened. Her voice was trembling, vibrating with an ugly, chaotic mixture of genuine fear and aggressive, defensive irritation. There was no motherly warmth, no polite small talk, and definitely no apology for the disastrous birthday dinner. "Your father just received a highly disturbing email from a national insurance carrier," she demanded, her words rushing together in a frantic stream. "What is going on with you? Are you suddenly drowning in consumer debt? Are you under some kind of severe corporate investigation at your firm? Did you do something stupid and cash out your retirement fund to buy a luxury car? You need to tell me exactly what kind of financial trouble you are in right now." She was projecting. It was a masterful, pathetic display of psychological projection. Because she and my father were currently drowning in fraudulent debt, she naturally assumed my large purchase had to be the result of a similar catastrophic failure. She literally could not comprehend a reality where her daughter was simply highly successful and financially independent. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I kept my voice incredibly low, perfectly modulated, and entirely devoid of any defensive emotion. "No, Mom," I replied smoothly. "I am just richer than you think." The silence that followed was heavy and profound. I could hear the faint, ragged sound of her breathing through the speaker. She was completely, entirely destabilized by the total lack of shame, guilt, or panic in my voice. She had expected me to stammer, to justify the purchase, to beg for her understanding, or to apologize for being irresponsible. My absolute, impenetrable calm shattered her script. Grasping desperately for the only remaining shred of authority she still possessed in our relationship, she cleared her throat, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. "Well," she stated coldly, trying to sound like a disappointed matriarch, "you still need to be here for the family meeting on Saturday night, 7 o'clock sharp. Your father and I need to sit you down and discuss this deeply erratic behavior before you ruin your life." She expected me to fight back. She wanted me to argue, to complain about the sudden demand, or to make an excuse to avoid them. She needed the friction to feel powerful. "I will be there," I said immediately, my tone bright and relentlessly agreeable. "I am actually really looking forward to it. See you at 7. I pressed the red button and ended the call before she could formulate a single response. I left her standing in whatever room she was in, holding a dead phone, completely paralyzed by a daughter who was suddenly refusing to play her assigned role. Later that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the city. I took the elevator down to the private, secured parking garage beneath the hotel. The overhead fluorescent lights reflected brilliantly off the sleek, dark hood of the new car. I unlocked the vehicle with a quiet click and opened the heavy passenger door. The interior light slowly illuminated the immaculate white leather. I held the thick, heavy-duty black binder containing every single piece of undeniable, ruinous evidence against my family. I gently placed the heavy binder squarely onto the passenger seat. I stood there in the quiet garage, looking down at the sleek digital keycard resting in the palm of my hand. Tomorrow afternoon, I was going to drive this incredibly expensive, highly visible machine straight into the heart of the suburbs. But as I looked at the black binder resting against the pristine white seat, my chest felt remarkably light. I finally understood the true nature of the impending confrontation. I was not driving back to my childhood home to beg for their love. I was not going to sit on their faded sofa and ask for permission to be angry. I was not driving there to be heard. I was driving back to permanently terminate a predatory business model that had disguised itself as a family for far too long. The late Saturday afternoon sun hung heavy and golden over the manicured lawns of my childhood neighborhood in Charlotte. I navigated the quiet, winding suburban streets, the electric motor of my new vehicle completely silent beneath me. The intense, blinding sunlight reflected harshly off the dark metallic hood of the car, striking the neatly trimmed oak trees and perfectly painted mailboxes. The blinding glare felt less like a simple trick of the light and much more like a silent, aggressive declaration of war. I was no longer the invisible, compliant daughter arriving in a sensible, used sedan. I was a hostile corporate entity breaching their borders. Pulling onto my street, I spotted my family's driveway from half a block away. It was impossible to miss. Parked aggressively across the concrete, taking up a careless and selfish amount of space, was my brother's commercial transit van. The entire massive vehicle was wrapped in a brand new, matte black and neon green vinyl decal. Massive block letters screamed the name of his newest, doomed venture, alongside a wildly hypocritical slogan that read, "Community First." The van was parked entirely crookedly, its rear bumper spilling over into the manicured grass, the front tires angled sharply. It was the absolute perfect physical manifestation of Beck. It was loud, expensive, entirely unearned, and built firmly on the foundation of someone else's quiet sacrifice. He was a man who perpetually built his personal brand using stolen capital. Instead of politely pulling onto the street to find a parallel parking spot, leaving him the clear, unobstructed exit he always demanded. I turned the steering wheel sharply. I guided the heavy, sleek electric vehicle directly up the concrete driveway, bringing it to a smooth, incredibly precise halt mere inches from the front bumper of his gaudy van. I shifted the transmission into park and engaged the emergency brake. It was a minor, seemingly petty geographic maneuver, but the psychological weight of the action felt monumental. For the very first time in my entire existence, I was deliberately, physically blocking the path of the one person in this household who was perpetually granted the right of way. I had severed his exit route. The heavy wooden front door of the house swung open before I even unbuckled my seatbelt. My mother, Marion, stepped out onto the wide brick porch. She was wearing her usual weekend attire, a crisp pastel blouse and tailored slacks, but her posture was entirely rigid. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She did not raise a hand to wave. She did not offer a welcoming smile. She stood at the top of the steps and stared down the length of the driveway at the gleaming metal machine as if it were a highly dangerous piece of physical evidence recovered from a violent crime scene, rather than a testament to her daughter's hard-won professional success. To her, my visible wealth was nothing but an offensive anomaly. The screen door rattled loudly on its hinges, and Beck squeezed past her. He was holding a half-empty bottle of imported pale ale, wearing designer sweatpants that cost more than a standard monthly car payment. He sauntered down the porch steps, his eyes narrowing defensively at the luxury vehicle. He let out a sharp, derisive laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet suburban air. "So," Beck called out, his voice dripping with that familiar, heavily patronizing blend of mockery and false affection. "Did you just rent this thing for the weekend? Did you need to take a few pictures to pretend your corporate life is a little less boring?" I did not answer him. I did not even look in his direction. I simply reached over to the pristine white passenger seat and picked up the thick, heavy-duty black binder containing his financial ruin. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the thick, humid Carolina air, the crisp sound of my heels striking the concrete driveway cutting through his arrogant laughter. Finally, my father emerged from the dark hallway. Ronan Wells stepped slowly onto the porch and stopped dead in his tracks. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask about my drive or offer to carry my bags. His eyes flicked rapidly from the intimidating $95,000 machine actively blocking his son's van, directly down to the heavy, meticulously organized black binder gripped firmly in my right hand. The residual color drained completely from his face in one rapid, terrifying wash. His jaw tightened instantly. It was the unmistakable, raw expression of an authoritative, controlling man who suddenly, violently realizes that the current situation has entirely breached his perimeter of control. He knew, just by looking at the binder, that I was not here to be scolded. I walked directly past all three of them without saying a single word, leaving them standing awkwardly on the hot brick porch. I crossed the threshold and stepped into the house. The conditioned air inside was frigid, carrying the faint, incredibly familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and synthetic vanilla air freshener. I stood dead center in the living room, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. Everything was exactly the same as it had been for years. The walls were an oppressive, carefully curated gallery dedicated entirely to the mythology of Beck Wells. There was a large, professionally framed photograph of him receiving a meaningless, minor neighborhood revitalization award. Next to it hung a vibrant, custom-matted canvas print of him aggressively cutting a thick red ribbon at a local grand opening for a business that had quietly filed for bankruptcy exactly 8 months later. There were multiple action shots of him holding a microphone, speaking passionately to small crowds at local zoning meetings. He was surrounded by expensive frames and dedicated spotlighting. I had to actively search the perimeter of the room to find any physical proof that I also existed in this family. Tucked away on a low, heavily shadowed bookshelf near the floor vents, there was a single, small photograph of my university graduation. The cheap plastic frame was slightly crooked. It was pushed all the way back into the darkest corner, partially obscured by a stack of old magazines, visually communicating my exact ranking in the household hierarchy. But as my eyes swept the room, a jarring, painful absence caught my immediate attention. It was a small detail, but it hit me squarely in the chest with the blunt force of a physical blow. The specific corner space located right by the large bay window was completely empty. For as long as I could remember, that exact space had been occupied by a beautifully crafted, antique mahogany side table. It was another specific heirloom piece left behind by Aunt Eleanor. Years ago, my mother had explicitly tearfully promised that the beautiful wooden table would be mine when I finally bought my own house. Now, the space was entirely bare, the thick carpet beneath it still showing the faint, circular indentations of its heavy wooden legs. It was gone. They had sold it. It was just another silent, ruthless transaction in a long history of theft. It was the ultimate, devastating sign that this family always possessed the terrifying, inherent ability to quietly liquidate my share of the world without ever bothering to notify me or ask for my permission. I walked slowly over to the large, plush sofa that anchored the center of the room. I sat down deliberately, taking up the space in the exact center of the cushions, refusing to shrink into the corner. I placed the thick, heavy black binder down on the large glass coffee table. The solid, heavy thud of the binder hitting the glass echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. I heard the front door close. They filed slowly into the living room behind me, their footsteps hesitant, uneven, and defensive. I leaned back deeply into the sofa, rested my hands calmly in my lap, and simply looked at them. I was not going to start this conversation. I was not going to demand a tearful explanation or loudly accuse them of anything. I decided right then to let them speak first. In my professional experience dissecting complex corporate catastrophes, the person who desperately rushes to open the trial is almost always the one who is absolutely terrified of being truly judged. I had the evidence. I had the chronological timeline. I had all the power in the room. I just sat there in the terrible, suffocating silence, waiting for one of them to speak. Ronan cleared his throat, leaning forward in his worn leather armchair. He clasped his hands together, resting his elbows on his knees. He was deliberately adopting the exact posture he used when he was about to deliver a severe reprimand. He looked at me with an expression of deeply responsible concern, a masterful performance designed to put me immediately on the defensive. "Olive, we called you here because we need to have a very serious conversation," Ronan began, his voice low and steady. "You drive up to this house in a vehicle that costs nearly $100,000. We need to know exactly where you got that kind of money. Buying a luxury item like that is an incredibly reckless financial action. It shows a complete lack of control." Marion immediately chimed in from the edge of the sofa, her voice dripping with manufactured maternal anxiety. "We just want to make sure you are not ruining your life. Sweetheart, we know the corporate world is stressful, but we do not want you drowning in terrible debt just to look successful to your peers. We are your parents. We have to step in when you lose your way." It was the classic strategy. It was the exact type of late, overbearing concern that only ever appeared when they realized they no longer had their fingers firmly wrapped around the steering wheel of my life. I did not sigh. I did not roll my eyes. I reached out and slowly opened the thick cover of the black binder resting on the glass coffee table. I bypassed the colored tabs entirely and opened the front interior pocket. I pulled out a small, neatly clipped stack of pristine corporate documents and slid them directly across the smooth glass until they stopped right in front of my father. "Let us clear this up immediately," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion, ringing through the room with absolute, clinical detachment. That top document is the official equity payout statement from Aegis Harbor Systems following our recent merger acquisition. The second page is my annual compensation package, outlining a base salary of $280,000, completely excluding my quarterly performance bonuses. The final page is a certified summary of my personal investment cash flow. Ronan stared down at the papers. The authoritative, concerned father routine vanished from his face in a fraction of a second, replaced by a blank, stunned paralysis. "I paid for the car in one single cash transaction," I continued relentlessly, refusing to give him a second to recover his footing. "I have zero consumer debt. I own my financial portfolio outright. So, we can permanently discard the ridiculous assumption that I am sitting in this room because I need you to teach me about money." Marion blinked rapidly, her eyes darting nervously between the staggering numbers printed on the corporate letterhead and my completely unreadable face. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The entire foundation of their interrogation had just been violently ripped out from under them. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees, mirroring my father's earlier posture. "However," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the sharp, cold edge of a freshly sharpened blade. "Speaking of major financial decisions, let us talk about my Homestart Trust." I flipped the heavy binder open to the very first index tab. I pulled out the printed PDF of the Eleanor Shore Trust Ledger and pushed it firmly across the table, right over my salary statements. The reaction was instantaneous and completely devastating. Ronan's face drained of color so fast he looked physically ill. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. Marion let out a sharp, involuntary gasp and immediately slapped her hand over her mouth. She stared down at the printed PDF with wide, terrified eyes, looking exactly like a woman who had just watched an old, buried corpse suddenly sit up in the middle of her living room. Beck, who had been leaning casually against the doorframe sipping his beer, frowned in deep annoyance. He pushed himself off the wall and walked over to the coffee table. "What is this?" Beck demanded, gesturing vaguely at the documents. "We were just talking about your ridiculous car. Why are we suddenly dragging out old family files?" He snatched the ledger off the table before my father could stop him. Beck's eyes scanned the dense rows of text and numbers. At first, he just looked bored, but then his eyes snagged on a highly specific string of words. He froze completely. "Wait," Beck muttered, his voice dropping its arrogant edge. "Beacon Yard Ventures, Common Ground Labs. These are my company names." He looked up at our parents, genuine confusion washing over his face. "Why are there transfer records for my lease payments and my studio renovations on a document with Olive's name at the top?" He looked back down at the paper, reading the dates and the exact withdrawal amounts out loud. $12,000 for the first commercial deposit, $8,000 for the contractor penalty fee. The room grew so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator running in the kitchen down the hall. Ronan desperately tried to seize control of the spiraling narrative. He held up his hands, adopting a placating, deeply reasonable tone. "Olive, you have to understand the broader context here. The family was navigating an incredibly difficult phase. We were trying to keep everything afloat. We were just moving resources around to manage the current crisis." "Resources," I repeated flatly. "That is an interesting word for an inheritance legally designated exclusively for my future." Marion leaned forward, her eyes brimming with sudden, defensive tears. She reached out, trying to employ the heavy, suffocating emotional morality that had governed our house for decades. Olive, please do not be so cold. Everyone in this house has made sacrifices. We do what we have to do for family. We all give up things we want so the people we love can succeed. I cut her off immediately. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute finality in my tone sliced right through her weeping. Sacrifice is different from being taken from without being asked. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Marian recoiled, as if I had physically struck her across the face. Beck dropped the ledger back onto the glass table. He crossed his arms, his face twisting into an ugly, defensive sneer. He was actively refusing to process the gravity of the theft staring him right in the face. "Oh, come on, Olive," Beck scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "At most, Mom and Dad just helped me a little more than they helped you. What is the big deal? You just showed us you are making hundreds of thousands of dollars. You obviously did not even need the stupid trust fund anyway." I looked at my younger brother, truly looking at him for the first time in my life. A sickening, profound realization settled over me, chilling me down to the marrow of my bones. The issue was entirely deeper and far more insidious than I had ever imagined. Beck was not standing there feeling guilty because he had maliciously conspired with our parents to steal my money. He was standing there feeling annoyed because he genuinely did not believe a crime had occurred. He had been so entirely coddled, so relentlessly prioritized since the day he was born, that he did not just benefit from the theft. He had grown up with the absolute, unquestionable belief that my portion of the world naturally belonged to his ecosystem. In Beck's mind, there was no boundary between his failures and my assets. He viewed my stability as a communal. Well, he was inherently entitled to drink from whenever he felt thirsty. My parents had not just robbed me to fund his businesses. They had fundamentally raised a man who believed my entire existence was merely a supporting column meant to hold up the crushing weight of his endless, massive ego. "It is a very big deal, Beck," I said softly, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his face. "Because taking money from an old trust fund was just the warm-up act." I reached out and placed my hand flat on the heavy black binder. "You think this is just about some old cash they gave you to pay your rent, but we have not even started talking about the actual fraud yet." I did not give them a single moment to catch their breath. The air in the living room had already grown thick, heavy, and utterly stagnant, but I was about to systematically remove whatever oxygen was left. The initial shock of the drained trust fund was merely the opening tremor. The real earthquake was still waiting in the next section of my files. I reached out and flipped a thick, reinforced plastic divider in the binder. The heavy metal rings snapped loudly, a sharp, metallic sound that made my mother physically flinch and press her back harder against the sofa cushions. I extracted a dense, stapled packet of legal documents and laid it directly over the trust ledger, perfectly aligning the edges with chilling precision. "This is a commercial beneficiary consent form," I stated, my voice dropping to a low conversational volume that somehow sounded infinitely more threatening than a scream. "It is a legally binding document pledging the remaining balance of my trust as temporary collateral to secure a massive, high-risk line of credit directly tied to Common Ground Labs. And right here, on the final signature block, is my digitally verified name." I pulled out 3 glossy sheets of paper from the front pocket and arranged them in a neat, undeniable row below the loan agreement. This digital signature was executed on the 14th of October at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I continued relentlessly. I tapped the first glossy sheet. "This is a certified copy of my airline boarding pass. It clearly shows I boarded a direct flight to Chicago at 8 o'clock that morning. The second sheet is my hotel folio, proving I was checked into my room and actively swiping my keycard at a convention center when this document was supposedly signed. The third sheet is my sworn corporate expense report." I raised my head and looked directly into my father's eyes. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rapid, uneven thud of his heartbeat. I was halfway across the country, surrounded by 3,000 industry executives. I did not sign this document. Ronan collapsed inward. The imposing, authoritative patriarch who had commanded every room he ever entered vanished entirely. He looked like an old, terrified, and deeply cornered man. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked down at the floor, absolutely unable to meet my gaze. "Olive," Ronan rasped, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming resonance. "I was going to explain it to you after things settled down." It was the most dangerous, pathetic thing a guilty person could possibly say. It was not an apology. It was a blatant admission of guilt, wrapped tightly in a lingering delusion of control. He still believed he had the right to manage the timeline of his own crimes. I let his weak, sickening excuse hang in the dead air for a few seconds before I reached back into the binder. "But you did not just forge my signature to secure a desperate cash flow loan," I said, my tone turning entirely clinical. "You actively drafted me into a highly regulated corporate entity without my knowledge." I pulled out a federal tax schedule and slid it directly toward Beck. The paper glided smoothly across the glass table and stopped inches from his hand. "You applied for a massive urban development grant," I told my brother, forcing him to look at the paperwork. "To make your application look incredibly attractive to the Municipal Oversight Committee. To make it look like you had stable, diverse financial backing. Someone listed me as a 15% silent equity partner in your new business. If your community center goes bankrupt, the federal tax authorities do not care about family dynamics. They will look at this schedule, they will see my name, and they will come after my assets, my salary, and my professional reputation to settle your debts." Marion finally broke. These were not the calculated, manipulative tears she had used to win petty arguments for the last 3 decades. This was raw, suffocating, unadulterated panic. She realized with absolute clarity that I had not just uncovered the old sins of the past. I had completely dismantled the active, ongoing fraud they were currently relying on to survive the upcoming fiscal year. She understood that the legal firewall protecting her golden child had just burned to the ground. She buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing loudly, the sound echoing harshly off the walls dedicated to her son's fake achievements. Beck, however, chose the only defense mechanism he knew. He chose blind, arrogant aggression. His face turned a deep, mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. He pointed a shaking finger at my binder. "You are completely unbelievable," Beck shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You drive up here in a luxury car, aggressively flaunting your corporate wealth in our faces. And you are trying to destroy us over some administrative paperwork. We are your family. You have more money than you even know what to do with, and you are choosing a shiny new car over your own blood." I did not blink. I calmly reached into the binder one last time and pulled out a single, printed email thread. "Am I choosing a car?" "Beck," I asked softly, "let us see what our father chose." I held the paper up and read the words printed on the page, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp clarity. "This is an internal message from our father to the commercial loan underwriter at the bank. Quote, use Olive's name on the primary application. It will make the approval rate cleaner because her credit profile is very strong. Do not bother contacting her directly. She will not check." Unquote. The living room went completely dead. Beck slowly lowered his pointing hand. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked at my father, who was still staring firmly at the carpet, then down at the damning email, and then back at me. The arrogant, self-righteous armor he had worn his entire life shattered into a million invisible pieces right in front of my eyes. For the very first time in his 30 years of pampered existence, the devastating truth pierced straight through his massive ego. His parents had not just loved him more. They had not just genuinely believed in his brilliant creative vision. They had actively built his entire identity, his businesses, and his fragile pride entirely on the back of his sister, utilizing methods that were fundamentally, legally fraudulent. He was not a misunderstood entrepreneurial genius struggling against a tough economy. He was a deeply subsidized parasite, and the host had just painfully detached itself. The realization hit him so hard he actually took a physical step backward, bumping into the wall. Ronan stood up from his armchair, his knees visibly shaking. He held his hands out toward me, palms up, in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Olive, please listen to me," Ronan begged, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the collapsing room. "You have to stop this. If you take this binder to the authorities, or even if you just formally back out of the equity agreements, you will immediately trigger a default. You will ruin the entire project before it even opens. You will completely destroy the family reputation in this town. You will ruin your brother's only real chance to finally make something of himself. We will figure out a structured way to pay you back over time, I promise you. Just give us time to fix this quietly." I slowly closed the heavy black cover of the binder. I placed my palms flat against the smooth glass of the coffee table and pushed myself up from the sofa. I smoothed the front of my tailored slacks, looking down at the three of them. They looked like strangers. They looked exactly like the desperate, cornered fraudsters I dealt with in my corporate continuity plans. "If I only knew up to here," I said quietly, the absolute stillness of my voice freezing the very air in their lungs. "You would not have panicked the way you did this morning on the phone. A forged loan and a fake equity stake are terrible, but you would have assumed you could just talk your way out of it. You would have assumed you could guilt me into playing along to save the family name, just like you always do." I picked up my purse and slung the strap over my shoulder. "The problem is," I whispered, delivering the final fatal blow to the illusion of the Wells family, "I also know about the deed." I opened the very last tab in the heavy black binder. I did not pull out a bank statement or a forged loan application. I pulled out a certified county property extract and the original closing documents for the family vacation cabin out at Lake Wren. The thick, cream-colored paper felt incredibly heavy in my hands. I placed the documents gently on top of the glass coffee table, right next to the forged commercial consent form. "5 years ago," I began, my voice perfectly level, "you were hit with a massive balloon payment on the Lake Wren property. You did not have the liquid cash to cover it. So, you authorized a direct wire transfer from the Homestart Trust to the title company." Ronan stared at the deed. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to a life behind bars. "You thought you were just quietly moving money from one family account to another," I continued, tracing the line of text on the deed with my index finger. "But because you used my designated trust funds to directly settle the final property lien, my beneficiary interest became legally attached to that real estate transaction. You legally cannot sell, transfer, or refinance the Lake Wren cabin without explicitly clearing my financial interest first." I looked directly at my father, watching the last remaining shred of his patriarchal authority crumble into absolute dust. "That is why you panicked so badly when I bought the car," I said, the truth finally ringing clear in the silent room. "You were not worried about my financial stability. You were actively in the middle of trying to quietly refinance the lake house to generate another massive cash bailout for Beck. When you saw that I had enough liquid capital to drop $95,000 on a vehicle in cash, you realized I also had enough capital to hire a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to freeze your entire transaction the second I found out." Marion finally broke. The perfectly maintained, suburban matriarch illusion completely dissolved. She slumped forward on the sofa, her shoulders shaking violently. It was not a calculated display of emotion designed to manipulate me into forgiving them. It was the ugly, visceral collapse of a woman who had just run out of lies to tell herself. "He falls apart so loudly. Olive," Marion sobbed, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, finally giving voice to the most profoundly cruel dynamic of our entire family. "Beck always collapses so loudly. Whenever he fails, the whole house shakes. But you were always so quiet. You were so capable. We just thought you could handle it. We knew you would be fine no matter what we took. You just kept taking the hits and moving forward." She had finally said the quiet part out loud. In this family. My resilience was not a virtue to be celebrated or rewarded. It was viewed entirely as an infinite, exploitable resource. My ability to quietly survive their neglect was the exact justification they used to actively bleed me dry. Beck let out a sharp, guttural sound, like all the air had been violently punched from his lungs. He was staring at the pile of documents on the coffee table. He looked completely unhinged, his eyes wide and wild. The grand, comforting illusion he had lived inside for 30 years had just been completely incinerated. "It is all fake," Beck muttered, his voice cracking. He looked back and forth between our weeping mother and our silent father. "My entire life is fake. Every single time you told me I was a brilliant visionary, every time you told me I was building a self-made empire, you were just writing checks with her name on them. You built my entire life on top of my sister." He was not angry at me. He was completely, utterly furious at them for allowing him to believe he was a competent adult, when in reality, he was nothing more than a highly subsidized dependent playing at being an entrepreneur. I did not scream at them. I did not cry. I did not demand any emotional apologies because apologies were entirely useless against legal liability. I simply reached into the back pocket of the black binder and extracted the final, thick stack of legal paperwork prepared by Mara Klein. I set the documents down on the glass table. "These are the final terms," I stated, my voice echoing with the cold, undeniable weight of a judge reading a final verdict. "This is a formal acknowledgement of the misappropriated funds. It includes a strict, non-negotiable repayment schedule. It contains a comprehensive clause releasing me from all tax and legal liabilities associated with every single corporate entity you fraudulently tied my name to. And it includes the immediate, legally binding removal of my identity from Common Ground Labs." I pulled a sleek metal pen from my purse and laid it carefully on top of the signature page. "You have a very short, very absolute deadline." I told them. "You will sign these documents right now. You will immediately initiate the complete liquidation of the Lake Wren property to fulfill the repayment schedule. If you refuse, or if you hesitate, my attorney will file a massive civil lawsuit in county court at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. She will simultaneously notify the commercial bank and the municipal grant agency that their current loan applications are entirely based on forged electronic signatures." Ronan understood immediately. There was no room left for negotiation. There was no fatherly power left to invoke. The game was entirely over. He reached out with a trembling, deeply aged hand and picked up the metal pen. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at Beck. He signed his name on the designated lines. The scratch of the pen echoing loudly in the suffocating silence of the living room. When he finished, he slowly pulled his cellular phone from his pocket. He placed it on the glass table, activated the speakerphone, and dialed the number of their real estate closing agent. He sat there, utterly defeated, and instructed the agent to completely halt any and all pending transactions regarding the Lake Wren property until they received explicit verified clearance from my legal counsel. I picked up the signed documents, checked them carefully for completion, and placed them securely back inside the black binder. I stood up from the sofa. "The car was never about proving I was better than you," I said softly, looking at the 3 broken people sitting in the living room. I did not buy it to show off. It was simply the very first time in my entire adult life that I spent my own money without subconsciously asking for permission from a family that had already taken far too much from me. I turned and walked toward the front door. I was not leaving to destroy them. I was simply leaving them to live in the exact, terrifying reality they had created. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded with brutal mechanical efficiency. My parents were forced to completely liquidate the Lake Wren property, handing the massive proceeds directly over to my attorney to satisfy the stolen trust funds. Without the constant, illegal infusion of my stolen capital, Beck's newest creative community venture collapsed entirely within 2 months. For the first time in his life, he had to abandon his fake brand and secure a real, grueling entry-level job just to pay his own rent. I maintained an absolute, impenetrable distance from all of them. I took back complete control of my finances, my legal identity, and my future. The greatest victory of my life was not the $95,000 electric vehicle parked in my garage. The true lasting victory was the singular moment in that quiet suburban living room when the entire house was finally forced to accurately name exactly what they had done to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and inspire even more people.